Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Oklahoma history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the autumn of 1907, as Oklahoma prepared to transition from territory to statehood, a peculiar series of disappearances began to trouble the newly established authorities. Travelers passing through Blackwoods County reported companions who simply never reached their destinations. Initially dismissed as the common drifting of transient workers in a rapidly developing frontier, these cases might have remained forgotten footnotes in history, if not for the discovery made in the spring of 1952. The Blackwoods homestead stood 3 miles from the nearest dirt road nestled against the foothills where the plains begin to rise. The property had remained abandoned since 1913, left to the elements after what locals only referred to as the incident. For nearly 40 years, the property remained untouched, becoming something of a forbidden zone among locals. They didn't speak of it directly. They simply drove another route, even when it meant adding miles to their journey. According to county records, the property was purchased in 1898 by Thomas and Martha Blackwood, who arrived from Tennessee with what neighbors described as unusual resources for settlers. While most families arrived with little more than a wagon of possessions, the Blackwoods constructed a substantial 2-story farmhouse within months. Local contractors were paid handsomely, but reported unusual specifications: thicker than normal interior walls, reinforced cellar doors and windows, placed higher than conventional design would dictate. The family consisted of Thomas, a man of few words who claimed to be a retired merchant; Martha, his wife, described in local accounts as pleasant but distant; and Thomas's brother Elias, a man who reportedly suffered from war injuries, though no one could specify which war. Their nearest neighbors, the Hendersons, lived 3 miles east and initially welcomed the new arrivals with typical frontier hospitality. Samuel Henderson, in a deposition dated November 1913, stated, "They seemed like fine Christian folk at first, kept to themselves, but that wasn't unusual out here. Martha would sometimes bring preserves when she came to town, always polite. Always invited us for dinner, though we never did accept. Something about the way they insisted made my wife uneasy." The Blackwoods quickly established themselves as hospitable to travelers. In an era before motels lined the highways, their home became known as a place where weary travelers could find a meal and lodging for the night. This reputation spread among stagecoach drivers and later among early automobile tourists. Their generosity seemed particularly focused on visitors who were alone or separated from larger traveling parties. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the methodical record-keeping discovered decades later. In 1952, when the property was finally sold for development, workers clearing the collapsed cellar discovered a hidden room. Behind a false wall, sealed with remarkable craftsmanship, they found a collection of journals, personal effects, and what appeared to be a meticulous guest register. The register, now held in the Oklahoma Historical Society archives, documented visitors spanning from 1899 to 1913. Each entry included a name, place of origin, and expected destination. More disturbing were the additional notations, physical descriptions, estimated weight, and cryptic symbols that researchers have struggled to fully decode. The final pages contained what appeared to be recipes, though their ingredients and purposes remain the subject of academic dispute to this day. State historian Margaret Whitaker noted in her 1960 analysis, "The Blackwood documents represent one of the most comprehensive and disturbing historical artifacts in Oklahoma's pre-statehood era. The methodical nature of the records suggests a family operating with clear purpose and deliberation, rather than acting on impulse or madness. The journal entries, written primarily in Thomas Blackwood's steady hand, present a chilling narrative of calculated isolation and predation. But to understand the horror that unfolded in that remote homestead, we must first understand the context of the time, a period when people could simply vanish into the vast American frontier, when communication was limited to letters that might never arrive, and when a family could exist for years beyond the reach of effective law enforcement. This is the story of the Blackwood family, the guests who never left, and the secrets that remained buried for nearly half a century. The Blackwoods arrived in the Oklahoma Territory in the spring of 1898, a time when the land was still being carved into properties and claims. Their arrival raised few eyebrows. New settlers were common as the territory approached statehood. What wasn't common was their apparent wealth and the speed with which they established their homestead. County records indicate Thomas Blackwood purchased 160 acres outright, rather than claiming it through homestead provisions. The transaction was conducted entirely in cash, a detail that would later interest investigators. The property sat at the edge of a small plateau, overlooking miles of prairie to the east, while backed by rising foothills to the west. It offered both visibility and seclusion, a combination that served their purposes well. The house itself was constructed with unusual attention to sound insulation. Between the outer clapboard and inner walls, builders later testified to installing layers of felt and sawdust, ostensibly for temperature regulation in the harsh Oklahoma climate. The cellar was dug twice as deep as typical for the region, with stone walls and a curiously complex series of rooms. When questioned years later, one of the builders, James Whittle, stated, "Mr. Blackwood was particular about those cellar rooms. Said he needed proper storage for preserves and winter supplies. Paid extra to have the doors reinforced. Said it was to keep varmints out. Never did see a homestead so concerned about raccoons." Martha Blackwood quickly established herself in the nearby town of Riverton's small social circle. She attended the Methodist church with regularity, though rarely stayed for post-service gatherings. The local mercantile owner, Edwin Porter, described her as proper in every way, but somehow distant, like her thoughts were always elsewhere. She purchased supplies with predictable regularity, except for meat. Despite keeping no significant livestock beyond a few chickens, the Blackwoods never purchased meat in town. Thomas Blackwood told neighbors he had been a successful merchant in Tennessee, retiring early due to a heart condition that required the drier air of the plains. No records from Tennessee ever confirmed this story. His brother Elias was rarely seen in town, appearing only for occasional supply runs. Described as tall and gaunt with a pronounced limp, Elias spoke little but observed much. Local children developed a habit of avoiding him on the rare occasions he appeared. The family's isolation was unremarkable for the time. Many settlers valued their privacy, and the distances between homesteads often meant weeks or months without social calls. What was remarkable was their selective hospitality. While declining most local invitations, they became known among travelers as unfailingly generous hosts. The Blackwoods placed a small sign at the crossroads 2 miles from their property. "Weary travelers welcome, meals and lodging available." In an era before commercial accommodations, such offerings weren't unusual, but the Blackwoods' reputation for comfort and hospitality spread quickly along the stagecoach routes. Madeline Conway, a school teacher who stayed with the family in 1903 while traveling to a teaching position in Kansas, wrote in a letter to her sister, "The Blackwood home is surprisingly refined for this territory. Mrs. Blackwood serves dinner on proper china, and the guest room is appointed with linens finer than any I've seen since leaving Boston." They seemed desperately eager for news and conversation from the outside world, particularly Mr. Blackwood, who asked endless questions about my journey and future plans. I find it curious that such cultured people would choose such isolation. Conway's letter, postmarked from the Blackwood property, is the last recorded communication from her. She never arrived at her teaching position. When relatives inquired months later, territorial authorities conducted a cursory investigation. The Blackwoods reported that she had stayed one night before continuing her journey, appearing in good health and spirits. With no evidence of foul play and the vastness of the territory, the investigation was soon abandoned. She was not the last traveler to vanish after being welcomed into the Blackwood home. The guest register discovered decades later tells a more complete story. Between 1899 and 1913, the Blackwoods recorded 46 overnight guests. Cross-referencing with missing persons reports and destination records reveals that at least 27 of these individuals never reached their stated destinations. The pattern was subtle enough to avoid raising alarms. A single disappearance every few months, spread across different counties and territories, with victims who often had few connections in the region. The register's notations grow more detailed and disturbing over time. Early entries contain basic information: name, origin, destination. By 1904, entries included detailed physical descriptions, health assessments, and notations about personal belongings. Some entries were marked with a small red cross, others with a circle. Those marked with crosses never reached their destinations. As 1907 approached and Oklahoma prepared for statehood, the Blackwoods' activities seemed to intensify. The register shows more frequent visitors, more detailed notations, and a system of selection that investigators would later struggle to fully comprehend. The household operated with clockwork precision. Martha maintained immaculate appearances, both personal and domestic. Thomas engaged guests with seemingly genuine interest in their lives and journeys. And Elias, according to the journal entries, managed what Thomas referred to only as the preparations. To understand what happened next, we must examine a critical turning point in the Blackwoods saga, the arrival of William Chambers in October 1907. Chambers was not like their typical guests. A journalist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, he was traveling through the territory gathering stories about the impending statehood. His name appears in the register on October 16, 1907, with the notation, "Curious type, asks too many questions." Red circle. The red circle, investigators would later determine, indicated a guest marked for a fate different from those with the cross. These were individuals who, for reasons the Blackwoods never explicitly stated, required special handling. Chambers' own notebook, discovered among the hidden artifacts, provides the only first-hand account from a guest's perspective. His initial entries describe the homestead in professional, observational terms. Blackwood property surprisingly well appointed. For Frontier, family presents as cultured, educated. Possible angle for article on refined pioneers bringing civilization to territories. His observations grow more questioning over subsequent entries. He notes the unusual thickness of the walls, the absence of other guests despite the family's reputation for hospitality, and small inconsistencies in the Blackwoods' account of their background. On the third day, his writing shows the first signs of concern. Mrs. B. set dinner again, with 6 places, though we remain only 4. When questioned, she seemed confused, then claimed expectation of additional travelers who never arrived. Mr. B. changed subject abruptly. Noticed interior doorknobs appear to lock from outside. The final entry, dated October 19th, reads simply, "Something wrong in cellar, heard sounds. B. claims old pipes, no running water in house, must investigate tonight." When family retires, there are no further entries in Chambers' notebook. His name in the Blackwood register bears both a circle and a cross, the only entry with both markings. What Chambers discovered in the cellar can only be pieced together through Thomas Blackwood's subsequent journal entries, which take on a tone of barely controlled panic following October 19th. "The situation with C has become untenable," he wrote. "His profession makes standard procedure impossible. Too many connections, too many people aware of his whereabouts. He believes we must accelerate our plans. M disagrees. First family discord in many years." For the first time, the meticulous Blackwood operation showed signs of strain. The careful selection of isolated travelers had been their protection, individuals whose disappearances would go unnoticed or be attributed to the dangers of frontier travel. Chambers represented a breach in this system, a guest whose absence would be investigated with resources and persistence they had not previously encountered. This disruption coincided with another significant change. Oklahoma's transition to statehood on November 16, 1907, brought with it more organized law enforcement and greater interconnection between communities. The isolation that had protected the Blackwoods was beginning to erode. Thomas's journal entries through November and December 1907 reveal increasing paranoia. He notes unfamiliar riders observing the property from a distance. He records Martha's growing insistence that they should abandon the homestead and establish themselves elsewhere. Elias, however, appears resistant to relocation, with Thomas writing, "E refuses to consider leaving, says the work is too advanced, the investment too significant. Reminded him that investment can be reconstructed, but we cannot. The nature of this work and investment remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case." The hidden cellar room contained not only documentation, but specialized equipment whose purpose has been debated by forensic historians. Glass containers, surgical implements, and a complex system of copper tubing connected to large ceramic vats suggest activities far beyond typical frontier household operations. Dr. Howard Richardson, consulting with the Oklahoma Historical Society in 1956, wrote, "The equipment discovered in the Blackwood cellar bears disturbing similarity to primitive blood processing apparatus. The journal's references to harvest, quality, and preservation take on horrific significance when viewed alongside this equipment. While I hesitate to make definitive statements about activities that seem too monstrous to contemplate, the evidence strongly suggests the systematic extraction and preservation of human biological materials. The winter of 1907-1908 marked a turning point for the Blackwood operation. The guest register shows only 3 visitors during these months, all marked with crosses. Thomas's journals indicate growing tension within the household, with Martha described as increasingly erratic and Elias spending more time in what is referred to only as the lower work area. The arrival of spring brought a new threat to the Blackwoods operation. In March 1908, the first automobile is recorded passing near their property. Thomas wrote, "Mechanical conveyance passed on Main Road today. Occupants stopped to consult. Maps. New era approaching faster than anticipated. Our isolation advantage diminishes by the day." The register shows a significant gap in visitors between March and June 1908. When entries resume, a new pattern emerges. Guests are no longer marked with crosses or circles, but with precise measurements and detailed notations about quality and yield. The operation appears to have shifted from selective predation to systematic harvest. This period coincides with reports in the Riverton Gazette of Martha Blackwood selling handcrafted medicines at the general store. Described as tonics for vitality and longevity, these tinctures in distinctive amber bottles became sought after among certain settlers. The newspaper noted, "Mrs. Blackwood's remedies have attracted attention from as far as Tulsa, with some claiming remarkable restorative properties." When asked about her formulation, Mrs. Blackwood modestly attributes her knowledge to old family recipes brought from Tennessee. No samples of these tonics survived for modern analysis. Their contents, like so much about the Blackwood operation, remained speculative. What is certain is that their production coincided with the most active period of visitor disappearances. A particularly disturbing aspect of the case emerged from the analysis of Thomas's private journal, kept separate from the guest register. In entries from late 1908, he describes what appears to be a philosophical justification for their activities. The modern man fails to recognize the ancient wisdom that life essence must be transferred, not merely sustained. What doctors call blood is merely the vessel for something far more profound. E has proven this beyond doubt in the lower chambers. The rejuvenative properties manifest most potently when the donor is in a state of heightened awareness. These entries suggest the Blackwoods operated under a twisted belief system rather than simple predatory instinct. Thomas makes repeated references to the old knowledge, Tennessee traditions, and practices our ancestors understood before science led them astray. This indicates the possibility that their activities were guided by some form of inherited folk practice or superstition, albeit transformed into something far more methodical and monstrous. The Blackwoods maintained their operation with remarkable discipline until early 1913. The final pages of the guest register show increasing selectivity in their victims with detailed notations about health, age, and physical characteristics. Thomas's journal entries betray growing concern about the changing landscape around them: more automobiles, more organized law enforcement, more communication between communities. Further details about the Blackwoods' daily operations emerged. From the testimony of Isaiah Jenkins, a traveling salesman who stayed with the family in June 1909 and, remarkably, departed unharmed. Jenkins's account, given years later to a Tulsa newspaper in 1923, describes peculiar household routines that, in retrospect, take on sinister significance. They had strict rules about meal times, Jenkins recalled. Everyone ate together, and Mrs. Blackwood was insistent about guests consuming every morsel on their plates. The brother, Elias, I believe was his name, would watch you eat with an intensity I found unnerving. They asked detailed questions about my health, whether I drank alcohol, if I suffered any ailments, how well I slept. I thought at the time they were simply concerned for my comfort. Jenkins also described the unusual sleeping arrangements. The guest room was comfortable but peculiar. The bed was positioned in the center of the room, not against any wall. The doctor had no interior lock, which I found odd. Most disturbing was the faint smell, something medicinal that Mrs. Blackwood explained away as a treatment for bed bugs, though I saw no evidence of such pests. What saved Jenkins, according to notations in the register, was his unsuitable condition, a cryptic assessment that may have referred to his self-disclosed history of malaria contracted during previous travels. The Blackwoods, it seems, were selective not only in choosing isolated travelers, but also in assessing their physical suitability for whatever purposes they had in mind. The precise mechanics of how the Blackwoods subdued their victims remains a subject of speculation. No restraints were found among the artifacts, though Thomas's journals make references to a preparation administered at dinner. Forensic analysis of cooking implements discovered in the cellar revealed trace amounts of several plant compounds with sedative properties, suggesting the possibility that guests were drugged before being moved to the lower work area. Martha's role in the operation appears to have evolved over time. Early entries in Thomas's journal describe her as hesitant and requiring constant reassurance about the necessity of our work. By 1906, however, she is characterized as fully committed and innovative in her adaptations of the formula. Her transition from reluctant participant to active collaborator represents one of the most chilling psychological aspects of the Arst case. The precipitating incident that finally ended the Blackwood operation came not from outside investigation, but from within the family itself. In February 1913, Thomas's journal records a severe disagreement between Martha and Elias. M discovered his personal experimentation. Confrontation ensued. M insists work has corrupted original purpose. E refuses limitations. First physical altercation within family. Situation untenable. Later entries suggest that Elias had begun experimenting with the formula in ways that even the Blackwoods considered transgressive. Thomas writes of abominations in the eastern cellar room and modifications to the process that violate all natural law. The nature of these experiments is never explicitly described, but they apparently crossed some boundary that existed even within the Blackwoods' already monstrous ethical framework. The final dated entry in Thomas's journal, April 17, 1913, reads simply, "It ends tonight. May God forgive what we cannot undo." What happened that night remains one of the great mysteries of the case. The Blackwood property was found abandoned in May 1913, when a rare social caller, Pastor James Miller, from the Riverton Methodist Church, arrived to check on Martha's unusual absence from services. His account, given to the county sheriff, describes a home that appeared to have been vacated in haste. Dinner plates still on the table, clothing still in wardrobes, but no sign of the family. Pastor Miller's official statement, preserved in county records, includes a detail often overlooked in discussions of the case. Upon entering through the unlocked front door, I was struck by an overwhelming odor, metallic and acrid, reminiscent of a slaughterhouse. The house itself was immaculate, showing Mrs. Blackwood's usual attention to cleanliness, which made the smell all the more incongruous. I called out several times but received no answer. When I approached the cellar door, I found it secured with a heavy padlock that had not been there during my previous pastoral visit. Something about that locked door discouraged further investigation, and I promptly left to notify the authorities. The subsequent investigation by the newly established Oklahoma State Police was perfunctory at best, with no evidence of violence in the visible portions of the house and no bodies discovered. The case was classified as an unexplained abandonment of property. The cellar door was noted in the report but never breached, a decision that would prevent the discovery of the house Blackwood's true activities for nearly 4 decades. Local speculation about the family's disappearance ran rampant in the months following their vanishing. The most common theory held that they had fled creditors despite no evidence of financial difficulties. Others suggested they had been victims of robbery or kidnapping, though nothing of value appeared to have been taken from the house. A few voiced suspicions about the family's true nature, but without evidence, these remained mere whispers. Meanwhile, the amber bottles containing Martha's tonics continued to circulate in the region for years after the Blackwoods' disappearance. The last known bottle was sold at a general store in Tulsa in 1917, suggesting either a substantial stockpile or the possibility that the Blackwoods continued their operations elsewhere under different identities. A tantalizing lead emerged in 1921 when a newspaper in Santa Fe, New Mexico, reported on a family called the Westmorelands, who had established a similar reputation for hospitality toward travelers along the increasingly popular automobile routes. The article described their home as unusually well appointed for the frontier, and noted that Mrs. Westmoreland sold homemade tonics with remarkable restorative properties. However, attempts by later researchers to locate records of this family in New Mexico archives have proven fruitless. The true horror of the Blackwood operation wasn't discovered until 1952, when land developers finally purchased the property for a planned farm equipment storage facility. The demolition of the deteriorating house revealed the elaborate cellar system, and behind the false wall, the documentation of methodical predation spanning 14 years. The most disturbing discovery, however, came when workers excavated the soil behind the former house. In a carefully plotted grid, marked in Thomas's journal as the garden, they found the remains of at least 22 individuals. Forensic examination was primitive by modern standards, but revealed that most of the remains showed evidence of systematic exsanguination before death. The bodies had been carefully preserved using methods that prevented natural decomposition, some for what appeared to be extended periods before final burial. Frank Wilson, one of the construction workers present at the excavation, described the discovery in a 1953 interview. "We thought we were digging foundation footings. The soil was different there, darker, richer. The first bone we uncovered, we thought it was animal. Then we found a jaw, unmistakably human. What was strange was how preserved everything was, like they'd been treated with something, and the way they were arranged, all laid out in perfect rows, like crops. I've been in the war, seen death before, but this was different. This was methodical." The investigation that followed was conducted primarily by Dr. Howard Richardson, then serving as the state's consulting forensic examiner. His initial report, submitted to the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation in June 1952, described the Blackwood case as unprecedented in my 27 years of forensic practice, a combination of methodical documentation and ritualistic preservation, suggesting a purpose beyond mere concealment of murders. Richardson's detailed analysis of the cellar equipment provided the first scientific understanding of the Blackwoods' activities. The complex arrangement of glass tubing, ceramic vats, and filtering apparatus appeared designed for the collection, processing, and preservation of human blood and tissues. Copper coils suggested a heating or distillation process, while the presence of various chemical compounds indicated methods for preventing coagulation and decomposition. Most disturbing were the specialized tools found in a locked cabinet within the hidden room, surgical instruments modified for purposes that could only be described as extraction and harvesting. Richardson noted that many of these implements showed evidence of extensive use and meticulous maintenance. The journals discovered alongside this equipment provided the philosophical framework for these activities. Thomas Blackwood's writings reveal a belief system combining elements of frontier folk medicine, misinterpreted scientific principles, and a twisted interpretation of vitalism, the once common belief that living organisms are sustained by a vital principle distinct from chemical and physical forces. Thomas wrote extensively about life essence and its transferability between individuals. He claimed that this essence was concentrated in the blood, but required specific processing to be useful. The raw material must be refined through our process to separate the vital principle from its crude vessel. E has perfected the method of extraction and concentration, while M has mastered the preservation formula. Together, we have achieved what the ancients only theorized. The apparent goal of this process was the creation of what Thomas called the elixir, the substance contained in the amber bottles Martha sold in town. The journals suggest that the Blackwoods themselves consumed this elixir regularly, believing it would grant them extraordinary longevity and vitality. Thomas wrote of noticeable rejuvenation and the reversal of time's decay, suggesting a delusional belief in the effectiveness of their gruesome concoction. No trace of the Blackwood family themselves was ever found, no records of their arrival. In another state, no death certificates, no further property purchases in any name associated with them. They simply vanished from historical record after April 1913. The most unsettling theory, proposed by Dr. Richardson in his 1956 analysis, suggests that the final conflict within the family may have resulted in the Blackwoods becoming the final victims of their own operation. He writes, "The evidence suggests a tragic symmetry, that whatever fate they had imposed on so many others was ultimately visited upon themselves. The absence of their remains among those recovered may indicate that the final act of this horror was the complete consumption or utilization of the perpetrators themselves." This theory gained support in 1961 when researchers analyzing the contents of the hidden room discovered 3 amber bottles similar to those Martha had sold in town, but larger and sealed with wax. Inside was a preserved organic material that tests identified as human tissue, preserved in a solution of alcohol and various compounds. Labels on the bottles, in Elias's handwriting, bore only initials: TB, MB, and EB. Dr. Eleanor Chambers, a historian specializing in frontier medicine, who examined the Blackwood artifacts in 1960, proposed a different interpretation of the family's sudden disappearance. The journals suggest an operation that had become increasingly sophisticated over time. It's possible the Blackwoods simply evolved their methodology to the point where complete physical relocation was no longer necessary, that they found a way to continue their work while integrating into a larger community where their activities would be less conspicuous. This theory points to several unconfirmed sightings of individuals matching the Blackwoods' descriptions in various western cities between 1913 and 1930. A hotel register in Denver from 1915 contains the signatures of a Thomas and Martha Winchester, whose handwriting bears striking similarity to samples from the Blackwood journals. A physician in San Francisco reported treating an elderly man in 1927 who claimed to be 102 years old but appeared no more than 70, and who spoke of a family remedy that had kept him vital beyond normal years. Perhaps most intriguing is a small medical supply company established in Portland, Oregon in 1920 under the name Vital Essence Laboratories. The company specialized in rejuvenative tonics sold in distinctive amber bottles until it abruptly closed in 1933. The owner, listed in business records as Elias Westbrook, was described by former employees as unusually knowledgeable about preservation techniques and obsessive about the quality of the blood used in testing. Whether the Blackwoods met their end in that Oklahoma homestead or continued their activities elsewhere under new identities, their legacy is one of calculated horror, a family who transformed frontier hospitality into systematic predation, who documented their crimes with clinical detachment, and who operated under a twisted philosophy that justified monstrous acts in the name of longevity and vitality. In 1968, the final chapter of the Blackwood story appeared to close when a fire of unknown origin destroyed the Oklahoma Historical Society's storage facility where the family's documents and artifacts were being held. All that remains of their operation are photographs of selected documents, the memory of those who examined the evidence, and the lingering questions about how many travelers truly fell victim to the family who never let guests leave. Dr. James Morrison, who had worked alongside Dr. Richardson in examining the Blackwood artifacts, expressed skepticism about the convenient timing of the fire. The destruction of that evidence occurred just as federal authorities were beginning to take an interest in the case. The fire was ruled accidental, but I've always wondered if someone connected to the Blackwoods, or perhaps to those who had consumed Martha's tonics over the years, might have had reason to ensure those materials never received further scrutiny. Ficor, precise number of victims will never be known. The 22 sets of remains found on the property likely represent only those who the Blackwoods deemed necessary to keep close, perhaps for ongoing harvesting or experimentation. The guest register's 46 entries with 27 confirmed missing persons suggests a much larger scale of operation. How many others may have been welcomed into that isolated homestead, only to become part of the Blackwoods' terrible work? Perhaps most disturbing is the question of legacy. Martha's tonic circulated throughout the region for years. Testimonials in the Riverton Gazette spoke of remarkable rejuvenation and ailments cured where doctors had failed. What exactly was in those amber bottles consumed by unsuspecting settlers? What effects might have lingered in the bloodlines of those early Oklahoma families? The answers died with the Blackwoods, or perhaps in the 1968 fire that destroyed the last physical evidence of their work. A statistical anomaly noted by demographic researchers in 1972 adds another layer to the mystery. A survey of longevity records in communities surrounding Riverton showed an unusual cluster of individuals who lived well into their 90s and even past 100, specifically among those who had resided in the area between 1908 and 1913. While multiple factors could explain this pattern, including selective migration and environmental conditions, some researchers have quietly suggested a connection to the circulation of Martha's tonics during that precise period. Dr. Morrison's final publication on the case, released shortly before his death in 1966, included a disturbing observation. What troubles me most is not just what the Blackwoods did, but what they might have discovered. If their journals are to be believed, if they genuinely found some method of transferring vitality from one human to another, however monstrous the process, then we must consider the possibility that this knowledge didn't perish with them. Someone else may have learned their methods, continued their work. The bottles we found with their initials suggest they themselves became part of their process. But who administered that final procedure, and where did that person go with their knowledge? Occasionally, rumors surface of amber bottles found in attics or root cellars across Oklahoma, their labels long faded, but their contents still preserved. Health authorities have issued statements discouraging anyone from attempting to open or analyze such finds, instead recommending immediate surrender to historical societies or law enforcement. The Blackwood property itself remains vacant to this day. The farm equipment facility was never built after the discoveries of 1952. The land was purchased by the county in 1970 and designated as a nature preserve, though locals note that wildlife seems to avoid the area where the house once stood. The soil there remains barren, despite decades of natural reclamation in surrounding areas. Park Ranger Michael Tanner, who has overseen the preserve since 1989, reports a persistent phenomenon. Every spring, the area where the house stood develops, a perfect rectangle of darker vegetation, exactly matching the foundation dimensions. The plants there grow faster, taller, more vibrant than the surrounding area. Soil samples show nothing unusual, no chemical differences we can detect. It's as if something in the ground is still active, still feeding the plants in ways we don't understand. Some nights, travelers on the highway that now runs 2 miles from the former property report seeing lights in the distance where the Blackwood house once stood. Rangers have investigated these reports multiple times, finding nothing but empty prairie and the foundations of a house that witnessed horrors beyond imagining. In the Oklahoma Historical Society's remaining archives, a single photograph survives. A family portrait of the Blackwoods taken in 1901. Thomas stands rigid and proper, his hand resting on Martha's shoulder. She sits with perfect posture, her expression pleasant but remote. And behind them stands Elias, tall and gaunt, his eyes focused not on the camera but slightly above it, as if seeing something beyond the moment being captured. These 3 individuals, unremarkable in appearance, carried out one of the most methodical campaigns of predation in American history. They welcomed travelers with seeming warmth, offered comfort to the weary, and transformed hospitality into horror. Their legacy is a reminder that evil often wears the most ordinary face, that isolation can conceal unthinkable acts, and that sometimes the most dangerous place for a traveler is the haven they've been seeking. An interesting footnote to the case emerged in 1957 when an elderly woman named Florence Barker approached the Oklahoma Historical Society with a story about her grandfather, who had been a stagecoach driver in the territory during the early 1900s. According to family lore, he had developed an unusual policy regarding the Blackwood homestead. Grandfather would never allow single travelers to disembark at the Blackwood crossroads. He'd claim the stop was canceled or the road too dangerous, anything to prevent solitary passengers from seeking lodging there. When asked why, he would only say, "Some places take more in than they ever let out." He carried that rule to his grave, never explaining further. This suggests that some locals may have harbored suspicions about the Blackwoods long before their crimes were discovered, yet remained silent, perhaps out of fear, perhaps due to the frontier ethos of minding one's own business, or perhaps because they benefited in some way from the amber bottles that made their way into town. The Blackwood case stands as a dark chapter in Oklahoma's early history, a chapter that might have remained forever closed had workers not breached that hidden cellar room in 1952. It serves as a grim reminder of the vulnerability of travelers in an era before instant communication, before digital footprints, before one's absence could be noted and investigated within hours rather than months. In a final disturbing footnote to the case, Dr. Richardson, whose analysis provided many of the insights into the Blackwoods operation, died unexpectedly in 1962, just 1 year after examining the contents of the amber bottles. His colleague, Dr. James Morrison, noted in correspondence that in the weeks before his death, Richardson had become obsessed with the Blackwood case, claiming to have discovered the true purpose behind their activities. Whatever insight he believed he had found died with him. His notes from that final period were reported missing from his office after his death. The circumstances surrounding Richardson's sudden decline, he went from apparent good health to death in just 3 weeks, have fueled speculation about potential exposure to unknown substances during his examination of the Blackwood artifacts. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, but Dr. Morrison later wrote, Howard was convinced he had identified the core component of the Blackwoods formula. He claimed it wasn't just blood they were processing, but something more specific, a particular element within the blood that, when extracted and concentrated properly, could produce remarkable physiological effects. The night before his final collapse, he called me in a state of great excitement, saying he had tested a microscopic sample on laboratory mice and observed unprecedented cellular regeneration. I urged caution, but he was beyond restraint at that point. When I arrived at his home the next day, I found him bedridden, his appearance shockingly altered, as if he had aged decades overnight. Dr. Morrison's subsequent investigation of Richardson's home laboratory revealed nothing conclusive. All samples had been destroyed, all notes burned. The only remaining evidence was a small amber bottle, empty but bearing traces of a substance that defied conventional analysis. Morrison surrendered this bottle to federal authorities, who reportedly classified all information related to it. In 1965, a journalist named Robert Carter began researching the Blackwood case for a planned book. His investigation led him to track down former neighbors and their descendants, searching for first-hand accounts of interactions with the family. Most were reluctant to speak, but one elderly woman, Esther Henderson, daughter of the Blackwoods, nearest neighbors, provided a disturbing recollection. My parents forbade us children from ever going near the Blackwood property, she told Carter. Father said they weren't like regular folks. Mother was more specific in her warnings. She told me once, "Those people don't age right." When I asked what she meant, she explained that over the years they'd known the Blackwoods. Neither Thomas nor Martha showed any signs of growing older. Their faces remained smooth, their posture straight, while my parents and the other settlers weathered and aged as people naturally do. Mother said it wasn't decent, the way they stayed young, said it was an offense against God's natural order. Carter's investigation was cut short when he'd suffered a severe stroke in 1966, leaving him unable to communicate. His notes, however, revealed another disturbing pattern, a possible connection between the Blackwoods and similar cases across the American frontier. He had identified at least 3 other instances between 1870 and 1920, where families had established isolated homesteads, offered generous hospitality to travelers, and eventually disappeared under mysterious circumstances. In each case, local legends subsequently emerged about the family's unusual vitality and longevity. The most compelling connection was to the Thornfield family of northern Montana, who operated a remote hunting lodge from 1882 to 1891. Like the Blackwoods, they arrived with unusual resources, maintained limited but strategic connections with nearby communities, and vanished suddenly, leaving behind an undisturbed property. When the lodge was finally examined in 1901, local authorities discovered a hidden cellar room containing equipment similar to that found in the Blackwood homestead, though no documentation or remains were recovered. Carter's note suggested he believed these weren't isolated incidents, but rather iterations of the same operation, perhaps even the same individuals, moving across the expanding American frontier, refining their techniques and methodology with each relocation. This theory, while speculative, offers a disturbing possibility that the Blackwoods were not unique but part of a larger pattern, practitioners of a horrific tradition that exploited the vulnerable and isolated nature of frontier travel. Anthropologist Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who studied Carter's research in the 1980s, proposed that the activities documented in the Blackwood case might represent an extreme manifestation of folk medical traditions transplanted from isolated regions of Appalachia. Her paper, Blood Beliefs and Frontier Isolation, contextualizing the Blackwood case, suggested that the family may have originated from a community where blood was believed to carry spiritual and vital properties, beliefs that, when removed from their cultural constraints and combined with the lawlessness of the frontier, evolved into something monstrous. What makes the Blackwood case so disturbing, Mitchell wrote, is not just the calculated nature of their predation, but the suggestion in their journals that they genuinely believed in the efficacy of their work. They operated not as mere killers, but as practitioners of a perverted science, meticulous in their documentation, progressive in their refinement of techniques. They saw themselves not as murderers, but as harvesters, collectors of an essential resource that happened to require human vessels. This perspective offers perhaps the most chilling dimension of the case, the transformation of superstition into methodology, of folklore into systematic predation. The Blackwoods had constructed an entire philosophical framework to justify their actions, complete with documentation, experimentation, and refinement. They were not impulsive killers, but careful researchers of human exploitation, developing their techniques over years of trial and error, all recorded in neat, dispassionate handwriting. The question that has haunted researchers for decades is whether the Blackwoods actually discovered something through their monstrous experimentation, whether their elixir contained some property that genuinely affected human physiology. The testimonials about Martha's tonics, the unusual longevity of certain Riverton residents, and the mysterious circumstances of Dr. Richardson's death all suggest possibilities too disturbing to dismiss entirely. Dr. Mitchell's research was abruptly discontinued in 1989 when her university funding was withdrawn without explanation. Her subsequent requests to access the remaining Blackwood photographic evidence were denied by state authorities who cited ongoing investigation, despite the case having been officially closed since 1968. In 1992, an anonymous source claiming to be a former government researcher contacted the Tulsa World newspaper with allegations that samples from the Blackwood case had been secretly preserved and studied by federal authorities for decades. According to this source, the Blackwood formula had been of particular interest to certain classified research programs focused on extending human performance and longevity. The newspaper chose not to publish these claims due to lack of corroboration, but the reporter who conducted the interview, Jessica Lawson, later noted that the source demonstrated disturbing familiarity with details of the Blackwood case that had never been made public. Whether these allegations had any basis in fact remains uncertain. What is clear is that the Blackwood case represents a unique intersection of frontier isolation, perverted folk medicine, and methodical predation, a combination that produced one of the most disturbing chapters in American history. Some secrets, perhaps, are better left undiscovered. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. The Blackwoods may have vanished from history, but the shadow they cast remains, a reminder that behind the most welcoming door may lie unimaginable darkness. For those traveling the highways of Oklahoma today, the journey is infinitely safer than in those territorial days. But occasionally, on the loneliest stretches of road, locals still warn against accepting hospitality too readily from strangers. Old habits die hard, and old fears die harder still. The memory of the Blackwoods lingers in cultural caution, a whispered warning passed down through generations. Be careful where you rest. Be mindful of those who seem too eager to welcome you in. In 2003, the final piece of the Blackwood puzzle emerged from an unexpected source. A historical preservation project in Tulsa uncovered a collection of letters in the foundation of a house built in 1920. Among them was correspondence between Martha Blackwood and an unnamed recipient, dated March 1913, just weeks before the family's disappearance. The letter, now preserved in the University of Oklahoma's special collections, provides the only insight into Martha's perspective on their activities. The work has progressed beyond what we anticipated, but at what cost? T believes we have achieved what the ancients only dreamed of, but I see how it changes us, not just in body but in spirit. E has gone too far. The modifications he's made to the process are abhorrent, even by our standards. I fear what we've become far more than. I fear what awaits us if we stop. If you receive no further communication, know that I have done what conscience demands, however belatedly. This final communication suggests that Martha, at least, had developed moral qualms about their activities, though far too late for their many victims. It also implies that she may have been the catalyst for the family's ultimate fate, perhaps taking action against Elias's escalating experimentation. The Blackwood homestead site was examined one final time in 2010 using modern forensic techniques unavailable in the 1950s. Ground-penetrating radar revealed additional remains beyond those discovered in 1952. At least 17 more bodies in the garden, bringing the estimated total to nearly 40 individuals buried on the property. More disturbing was the discovery of a previously undetected chamber beneath the cellar, accessible only through a narrow shaft that had collapsed decades earlier. This chamber, when finally excavated, contained 3 stone crypts arranged in a triangle. Each was empty, but bore inscriptions: Thomas Essence, returned, Martha, vessel emptied, and Elias, transformation completed. The meaning of these inscriptions remains subject to speculation, but they suggest a ritualistic conclusion to whatever process the Blackwoods had been developing throughout their years of predation. Dr. Alan Ferguson, who led the 2010 excavation, noted in his report, "The arrangement and inscriptions in the lower chamber suggest a planned conclusion rather than a hasty abandonment. Whatever occurred in April 1913, it appears to have been the culmination of the Blackwoods' work rather than its interruption. The question that continues to haunt this investigation is not just where the Blackwoods went, but what they may have become. This final discovery has led to a disturbing theory, that the Blackwoods never actually left their homestead, at least not in any conventional sense. The empty crypts, the ritualistic inscriptions, and Martha's cryptic final letter all point to the possibility of some kind of planned transformation or sacrifice, the exact nature of which remains mercifully obscure. The Blackwood case stands as a singular example of frontier horror, a reminder that the American West was not just a landscape of opportunity and adventure, but also a vast territory where isolation could conceal unthinkable acts. The family who never let guests leave created a legacy of fear that continues to resonate more than a century after their disappearance. Their story serves as a dark reflection of the American frontier experience, hospitality perverted into predation, opportunity transformed into exploitation, and the quest for longevity mutated into something monstrous. In the isolated spaces of a developing nation, the Blackwoods crafted their own terrible version of the American dream, one built on the systematic harvest of unwary travelers who simply sought shelter for the night. Today, the former Blackwood property remains part of the county nature preserve, marked only by a small, unobtrusive plaque that makes no mention of the horrors that occurred there. Wildlife continues to avoid the immediate area where the house once stood. Rangers report that GPS devices often malfunction near the site, and compasses show slight but persistent deviations. The land itself seems to remember what happened there, even as human memory fades. For those who study the case, the most disturbing aspect remains the meticulous documentation, the evidence of how systematic, how calculated the Blackwoods' predation had been. Their journals reveal not frenzied killing, but careful selection, not impulsive violence, but studied methodology. They had transformed murder into process, death into resource extraction, and human life into raw material for their twisted quest for longevity. In the end, the Blackwood case reminds us that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural creatures, but human beings who have abandoned their humanity in pursuit of their desires. The family who never let guests leave created their own. Unique horror, one born not of ghostly haunting or demonic possession, but of the methodical exploitation of human vulnerability and trust. Their legacy lingers in the collective memory of Oklahoma, a cautionary tale passed down through generations. Be wary of too perfect hospitality, of isolated homesteads, of strangers whose kindness seems too calculated. And, perhaps most importantly, be mindful of the ancient wisdom that has taken on new meaning in light of the Blackwood case. Never enter a house where you haven't seen anyone leave, because sometimes the most dangerous threshold is the one that seems most inviting to cross.